The next time you see the moon shine, look closely at the right edge. There's a tiny dark oval there. It is located on a large plain surrounded by mountains, one of the most beautiful in the moon, known as the Mare Crisium, or Sea of Crises. This area had never been explored until we arrived. I was the leader of the group assigned to explore the southern area of the Mare. We had covered 150 kilometers in a week. We had skirted what seemed many millions of years ago to have been an ancient sea. On the ground we walked. There had been an ocean with a depth of 800 meters. And now the only trace of moisture that could be found was the frost that we sometimes discovered in the caverns, where the sunlight never penetrated. In our spacesuits, we searched for interesting minerals, or we put up signposts to guide future travelers. We had some pressurized tractors, and if something happened to us, we always had the radio to ask for help. After which, what we had to do was wait for the arrival of the ship that would come to our rescue. At our base, we lived according to terrestrial time, and at exactly 10 p.m. we sent the last message by radio and finished our work. Outside, the rocks were still burning in a nearly vertical sun, but for us it was night until we woke up again, after 8 hours of sleep. We tried to follow earthly routines so as not to drive our bodies crazy. We'd make breakfast together, and when the smell of sausage and bacon began to fill the cabin, it was hard to believe we hadn't returned to our planet. Within how special it was to be on the moon, everything was very familiar, and we lived with a certain normality. That day I prepared breakfast for my colleagues. Despite the years that had passed, I remember that moment with extreme clarity. Our driver was already outside in his spacesuit, inspecting the tracked vehicles. And my partner in the control cabin was writing something about the previous day's work in the logbook. As I waited for the bacon to cook in the pan, I let my gaze wander over the mountainous walls that line the southern horizon. Those mountains rose up to 3,000 meters. They were very tall. I looked up at peaks no man had ever scaled. And I was about to turn when my gaze was drawn by a metallic flash almost to the top of one of the rocky outcroppings. It was a tiny point of light. My first thought was that it was probably a very smooth rock that caught the sunlight and reflected it directly into my eyes. But I was curious to know what kind of rock could glow so brightly up there. So I went up to the observation turret and pointed our telescope to the west. I could see the peaks better, but the object reflecting the sunlight was still too small to identify. However, although I couldn't see it clearly, I could tell that it had a certain symmetry. At that moment, a colleague called me and I went to help him. As we went through our routines, we discussed what I had seen. My colleagues maintained that no intelligent life had ever existed on the moon. I knew as well as the rest that this was so, but I needed to identify that object. At first glance, these mountains seemed practically unscalable, but here the weight was reduced to a sixth. So I decided to head to the place. My partner Lewis offered to accompany me. He was a good climber and had participated with me in other similar expeditions. Our companion Liz would stay on the tractor so we could communicate by radio. Lewis and I made our first stop on a ledge, 500 meters up. The climb hadn't been difficult, but we were quite tired. We looked down at the tractor, which looked like a small insect, and we reported our progress to Liz before continuing with the climb. The road was rough, but the views of the landscape that we had from there were extraordinary. Above all, knowing with certainty that we were the first men to climb those mountains. As I climbed, I convinced myself that the object I had seen was nothing more than a rock produced as a result of a meteorite. When we were only 20 meters away from the place, Lewis gave me an anxious look. I smiled at him through the glass of my helmet and shook my head. Then slowly and unhurriedly, I started the last stretch of ascent. When I reached the edge, I paused for a moment to wave to my companion. Until that moment, I was convinced that I wasn't going to find anything strange there. However, when I arrived, I found an esplanade about 30 meters deep. It looked as if it had once been smooth, but probably meteorite impacts had warped its surface. And there in the center was a translucent pyramidal structure, about 3 meters high, embedded in the rock. The first few seconds I was in shock, but when I was assimilating what my eyes were seeing, I felt a strange sensation. I was discovering that on the moon, an earlier civilization had existed. The ancient dreams of the first explorers were true. And although we had arrived thousands of years late, at last man could tell about this important event. Then my brain began to ask questions, such as what was that construction? If it was a sanctuary or some other building? If it was a home, it was strange that it had been built on such an inaccessible site. I took a few steps forward to examine the building more closely, but not too closely. I thought of the Egyptians and their pyramids. They had created similar constructions in their time. But I couldn't figure out what kind of civilization could have flattened that mountain and raised that surface. The idea that intelligent lives had existed on the moon was in itself very difficult to assimilate. But I was probably examining the product of a race more advanced than ours. I continued to watch, and thoughtfully stared at the thick layer of cosmic dust on the esplanade. Both the dust and the marks left by the meteorites ended abruptly at the edge of a wide circle. And in the center was the pyramid. It was as if an invisible wall protected it from the constant bombardment that occurs in space. Suddenly, I realized that someone was yelling at me through my headphones. Lewis had been calling me for a long time. I walked to the edge again and waved for him to come up. Then I turned back to the circle in the dust. I leaned down and grabbed a piece of rock. I didn't know what would happen, but without thinking, I threw the stone towards the pyramid. And the boulder just fell to the ground, as if it had hit a curved surface. The object before me could not be compared to any work of my ancestors. It was not a construct, but a machine, protecting itself through forces that had defied eternity. And whatever those forces were, they were still going despite the years. I thought of all the radiation known to man, that perhaps I had already gotten too close. It might even be that I was already doomed forever after passing through that atmosphere. I turned to Lewis, who had joined me and was standing motionless beside me. He was looking in amazement in the same way I had a few seconds before. I went back to the edge of the esplanade, making an effort to put my thoughts back in order. I looked up at the stars and wondered what was there when these strangers had finished their work. I had convinced myself that this object had been built by a race that had lived in the past. But suddenly I realized that this race was as foreign on the moon as I was. In the 7 years that we had been exploring, we hadn't found any other trace of life, except for some degenerate plants. It would be strange that if there was a lunar civilization, it would only leave that proof of their existence. My companions and I decided to return to the base and tell everyone what we had discovered. Altogether, we started a new exploration, much more exciting than the one we had as a goal. We investigated each part of that object. We broke pieces to find out its purpose or its origin. And in those fragments, we could see that there was nothing. The mechanisms of the pyramid were the product of a technology that was far beyond our horizon. The mystery of the pyramid continued to torment us more and more. We believed that the Earth was the cradle of all intelligent life in our system. But after analyzing that dust on the esplanade, we were able to calculate that it had settled there before life made its appearance on Earth. Therefore, it couldn't have been a civilization of our world. About 100 billion stars revolve in the circle of the Milky Way. And a long time ago, another race had reached that same point. That race could have explored the galaxies as we explore the other worlds. They could have observed the Earth, coming to the conclusion that in our world, where life didn't yet exist, intelligence could arise. But there were countless stars ahead of them, and probably they would never return this way. So, they decided to leave a Sentinel, and this could be one of the thousands that could exist in the universe, watching over the worlds in which life would be possible. That pyramid was a beacon, which through all the ages indicated them that no one had discovered it yet. And why was the glass pyramid installed on the moon and not on Earth? Because its creators could only be interested in our civilization if we gave proof of our ability to survive, launching into space and escaping from Earth, which is our home, which would be one of the most important challenges for intelligent races. We've discovered the pyramid, and we've destroyed it to identify and investigate it. So now it no longer emits any signal. Those in charge of watching their trail must have turned their attention to Earth. Right now they may be heading towards our civilization, but I don't know if they're friendly or if they have other intentions. All our lives we've imagined what aliens would be like, being certain that they really do not exist, and we're the only ones in this universe. Now we've activated their alarm, and we can do nothing but wait. Although I think we'll not have to wait too long. They're already on their way.
If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it. And if you want to see more Draw My Life videos, subscribe to our channel. See you on the next episode.